Well, hello and welcome to this Bible study that we are doing this year on the Gospel of John. I'm glad that you could be here with us today. How this is going to work over these next weeks is I will give a 10-minute teaching or so, and then that will be followed by a time of questions that you can either do within a group, in a community, or you can just reflect on yourself. And then out of that, there will also be a time for you to act upon whatever is taught. I'm so excited to share with you the Gospel of John. If you've never studied this book before, then you are in for a treat because the Gospel of John is different than the other Gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were actually synoptic Gospels, and John is kind of set apart. About 90% of the book of John is unique to John itself. Now, what's interesting about John is who was he? Well, he was obviously a disciple of Jesus. He was called, him and his brother combined in the scriptures were called the sons of thunder. So you can probably get an image in your mind of who John was just from that statement. But he was also known as the beloved disciple of Jesus. And so he was part of the inner circle of Christ. He was there during the transfiguration. He was there at the crucifixion. And he was the one that Jesus said to him when he was dying on the cross, to his mother, please take care of one another, essentially. And so Jesus obviously trusted John. And so the words of John are incredibly poetic. He was a poem. He was a poet, which is why we're doing this study inside this maker studio, because it reminds us that John was a maker, a creative, and so much of his words are abstract, but they teach us a lot about what it means to live in this life. And so before we even open chapter 1 today, the book of John and its overview is really about John proving the divinity of Christ more than the humanity of Christ. And so much of the other gospel accounts are about the humanity, but John is really focused on the divinity. And so the book of John is known for its I am statements, which we're going to be getting into in the coming weeks. But for now, I want to explain to you real briefly about the difference between the gospel accounts. First, when you go into serious study of the Bible, there are two fields really that those that study the Bible and interpret it are operating within. The first is an exegesis, which is where you take a text and you try to understand the context of that text and the genre of that text and all the things surrounding that text to come up with a critical interpretation of a text. Then once you have exegeted a text, you move to hermeneutics, which is how you take that interpretation and you apply it essentially to the everyday part of your life. Now, we do that all the time as pastors. We're constantly exegeting text and then doing hermeneutics, giving sermons about how this relates to our everyday life. But what's unique about the Gospels is that they are living hermeneutics. So basically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all experienced Jesus, but they took the account of Jesus, they took his words, they took his offerings, they took his teachings, and they applied it to certain situations. And so we get a first-hand look at how hermeneutics operated in the beginning, in the first century. So it's fantastic or amazing to see that through the book of John. Because the book of John is not written chronologically like some of the other accounts. He picks certain stories of Christ and he puts them in a certain order to try to teach us something. And so John chapter 1, as a result, is incredibly important because it sets the context for what he is trying to teach. And here is what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now, just those opening verses of the book of John sound rather poetic, don't they? They also sound rather familiar because they're connected directly back to Genesis 1:1, where God created the world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is being reiterated in John chapter 1:1, and this is the only gospel that reaches back all the way to the beginning of time. And so what John is trying to do here is he's trying to include all peoples of all nations and all tribes in the Greek-speaking world at this point into the story. And we know that because in the beginning was the Word, is what John says. Now, if you look in your biblical text, I would suspect that word is capitalized. And there's a reason for that, because it doesn't mean just speaking. The word here is actually the word logos in Greek. And the word logos in Greek was connected really to the foundation of all things. So not just physical things, not just like an atom, but was connected to the logos was the foundation of all beauty and creativity and love and emotions and all those things that you experience. So in a Greek hearer's mind, the logos was it, the foundation. And so when John says in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Here John is connecting God, Yahweh God, the Hebrew God, with the foundation of all things. Now we see here in John chapter 1 that the Trinity is present throughout this whole thing, but the name of Christ actually isn't mentioned until verse 17. So the first 16 verses of the book of John, Jesus Christ is not mentioned by name. But we see here the entire Trinity just in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, which is Christ. Because as we spoke in creation, God's voice spoke us into being. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We see God the Father there, and we see and imagine in Genesis chapter 1 the Spirit hovering over the waters. And so we have here the Trinitarian understanding of God right at the beginning of the book of John. What this tells us is that Jesus was present. Jesus was present long before he came in flesh. And that's what John wants us to know, that the divinity of Christ existed long before the flesh of Jesus Christ, which didn't come until chapter 17, that the Logos, Christ, was with God in the beginning of creation and then took the form of a human being later on when God's plan was to send his son, Jesus. Now, it also goes on to say that not only was he in the beginning with God, but that all things, in verse 3, came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. We have here John elevating Jesus Christ, just in case these hearers were dismissing the divinity of Christ, elevating Christ to being with God in the beginning, one with God. He wasn't just subservient to God. It wasn't God and then Jesus. God and Jesus were one, and the Holy Spirit was there between them, and we see him being elevated, and he is called light. Now, I don't know about you, and we'll go into a later discussion of light in another Bible study, but the object of light, or what does light do? Well, light does a lot of things. It not only exposes darkness just by its very nature, it also brings things into being. It's life. Without light, there would be no life. And so light itself is found in Jesus Christ, that the very light of this world has come into our world, the Logos, the light, in order to, in his own identity, expose that which is lying in darkness. And so light does more than expose, though. It keeps us warm. It's the thing that heats our homes. It's the thing that we make food with. Without light, we cannot do these things. And so light becomes the very essence of human existence, and Jesus Christ is being touted as that light. And so it says, it goes on continuing in chapter 1, that there was, in verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. And John here in the gospel is not talking about himself, he's talking about John the Baptist. He says that he came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into this world. Verse 14, he goes on to say, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of his Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Verse 16, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. You know, we have the story here of Jesus becoming flesh So John takes this divinity, this logos, this foundation of all things, and says, and now it is found within a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And that this person in verse 14 dwelt among us. That word here is actually better translated as tabernacled among us. Not just dwelt, but tabernacled. And so this would connect back to the Jewish people and their wanderings in the wilderness in the book of Exodus, where they wandered for 40 years and God tabernacled among them, quite literally. He had them set up a tabernacle to reveal his presence to them. And the same word is used of Jesus, that Jesus has come to tabernacle among you, to show my divine presence among you. Jesus is a revelation that God is with us. And so it's kind of fascinating that the book of John begins with this incarnation, making this bold statement that Jesus is not just human, that Jesus is the Logos, the foundation of all things, found in bodily form, tabernacling among us, so that we might in turn know and sense the presence of God. How does that sit with you today? What does it mean? How does it change our lives to know that the foundation of all things is found in the person of Jesus Christ? What does that speak about our God? What does that speak about our God in your life? I hope you've enjoyed this first session of the book of John. And please now, it's time to turn off your screen or to pause your screen so you can reflect on the questions that have been provided for you. We'll see you next time.
In the beginning was the Word, the foundation of all things. In the beginning, the Spirit hovered over the waters, bringing peace and order to the chaos. Now, as a way to reflect on that this week, if you are able, head to a body of water and just sit and just watch the water, watch those waves, watch the water lapping and listen. Imagine that Spirit hovering over the waters. Imagine that order from chaos being brought forth. Imagine all things. Breathe in God's creation. Breathe in God's peace. And just sit and listen and be reminded that you are a beautiful creation of God.
In the beginning, you hovered over the water. You broke an unbroken silence. You spoke light into darkness, and there was light. In the beginning, we were made in your image, and we were naked without shame, till we fell for the darkness, and there was night.
Now, each week we do want to internalize some of these messages and lessons that we're getting out of Scripture. And so as we just heard, that you can either head to a body of water or maybe just even pull up some creation imagery on your computer and reflect on that. And one of the other things that you can do is we also heard how God dwelt among us. So God's divine presence is among us. So bring to mind a situation or a circumstance when you knew that God was with you. Where was it? Who is there with you? Or maybe it's a certain object that reminds you that God is with you. Or maybe it's a certain activity that you do that you know just aligns with your God-given gifts. So bring that to mind. And if you're doing this with a group of people, I encourage you to share that with one another. And I'm actually standing here in front of this piece of art by Scott Erickson that reminds me every day that God is with me. So I have this piece of art in my office, and I have a similar print by Scott Erickson in my home that reminds me that I'm being held in God's hands, that no matter what the circumstances are in the day or in my life or in that season, that there is nowhere that I can go from God's love and His presence. So this is my reminder I get multiple times throughout the day that God is with me and that God is holding me in His hands. So I hope that you are reminded of that this week as well, and that